Classical economics understood the chains of cause and effect that constitute the economic phenomena of the world. These chains of cause and effect have to be understood as being dictated by physical nature, objective supply conditions determine what's going to happen. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood in a way that's absolutely true, obviously true. If we were living on the surface of the sun, we would not have much of an economy. So sure, the economic conditions are a product, if you will, of physical conditions. Okay. But we're not talking about the state of affairs. We're talking about the chains of cause and effect. What drives the chains of cause and effect? Well, the classical economist said what drives the chains of cause and effect in economic phenomena is physical nature. Physical nature is responsible for value. The phenomenon of value is determined by supply conditions. Ricardian economics, which is the core of classical theory, sees everything as being determined by, explained by, understandable by virtue of physical reality. To the classical economists, economics was the science of wealth. There's something called wealth. The question is, what are the determinants of wealth? How is wealth created? What is the size of the bundle of wealth that is created in any given period? And how is that bundle of wealth distributed among the different economic classes, economic agents that contributed to produce it? They were not focusing on the components of wealth. And for them, basically, wealth meant bread. And this perspective then sees nature, supply, as being dominant. Man adjusts to nature. And of course, there is a lot that is absolutely true in that insight, but it's certainly not the full picture. Neoclassical economics, it began to be recognized that the explanation of the chains of cause and effect that make up economic phenomena has to be sought, at least partly, in consumer demand. Specifically, the revolution occurred in the theory of value. The classical economists saw value as determined by costs. Costs of production determine value. The neoclassical economists began to recognize that besides the conditions of supply, which reflect cost, there are the conditions of demand, which represent the consumer valuation. For Marshall, what he explained was that you've got supply and demand. Supply expresses objective cost conditions. Demand expresses subjective demand, consumer demand conditions. And it is the interplay of these two forces, the forces of supply, the forces of demand, the forces of the objective reality, physical reality, and the forces of subjective preferences. These are the two blades of the Marshallian scissors. These determine what the price of an object will be. Austrians, beginning with Menger, had a different view. They saw value as being determined purely by consumer decisions. Now, once again, I don't want it to be thought that Austrians would say that if you put a same bunch of consumers down on the surface of the moon, you'll get the same economic conditions as that bunch of consumers on the face of this earth. Obviously not. But the point would be that for the Austrians, the physical conditions are passive. They are the background, the active force. The active determinants of the chains of cause and effect are consumer preferences, consumer desires, against, admittedly, the background of given physical conditions. Granted. Okay? But there is a tremendous difference between a Marshallian scissors approach, where you've got these two co-equal major forces that are interacting. That's the Marshallian view. You contrast that with the Austrian view, where it came to be emphasized that supply conditions are consumer determined as well. Because what determines the supply of any particular commodity? Well, it depends on cost, sure. And what are the costs? What determines the cost of production of any particular consumer good? Well, the answer is it depends on the prices of the resources necessary to produce it. But what determines those prices? Well, it's the fact that these resources are useful in other industries to produce other goods which consumers want. Therefore, it is the degree of urgency with which consumers desire the fruit of these resources elsewhere that determines the cost of production in this industry that we're talking about. So that supply is simply disguised demand. It is the reflection of demand. This is the basic insight which is often labeled opportunity cost. Costs are all foregone opportunities which represent that which is desired by consumers. I'm simplifying to a drastic degree. But this was the nub of the disagreement between the Austrians and the Marshallians. Think of it as on top you've got physical reality. This, for the classical economists, was everything. At the bottom, you've got consumer preferences. These are subjective. These are objective. Objective, subjective. Consumer preferences are subjective. Whether you like vanilla or whether you like chocolate, that's subjective. Okay? Whether the temperature is 90 degrees or 120 degrees or 30 degrees, that's objective. Now, in the market, in an economy, the consumer's desires have to be satisfied by products that are produced from physical reality. If it's food, if it's clothing, if it's housing, if it's transportation, it's all produced from physical reality. So, in an economy, in a market economy, you've got producers. And putting things in their starkest simplicity, producers buy resources and they sell consumer goods. You buy land, labor, and translate that into bread for consumers. Okay? So you've got producers who take physical inputs and translate them into the satisfaction of consumer desires. There is no question about it that the chain of cause and effect, this is the cause and this is the effect. The bread that you eat was caused by physical reality. Well, how did the bread come? Well, the bread came because they had earth, you had people scratching the earth, you had people baking, and you got bread. The chain of causation is a one-way causation from physical reality to satisfaction of consumer demands. No question about it. And let me point out that from the classical point of view, it is this direction, this unidirectional chain of cause and effect, which determines all economic variables. The price of land, the price of labor, the price of bread, everything is determined by this unidirectional set of causes and effects. Costs determine values. Value is determined by costs. Okay? Because look, that's the way it goes. Menger glimpsed a fundamental truth, a revolutionary truth, that is exactly the opposite. That the economic chain of cause and effect is exactly the opposite, from the consumer all the way up to him. Now you may say, but this is absurd. The consumer who wants bread does not create land. He does not create labor that scratches the land. He does not create the plows that plow the land. He does not create the oxen that pull the plows that plow the land. True. Of course not. Of course not. But what Menger glimpsed was that everything we know in the world is determined by the fact that consumers have preferences. Because they have preferences, therefore they are purposefully pursuing those objectives which they have. And people have different purposes. And because people have different purposes, this translates itself into market prices which are determined entirely by consumer preferences against the background, the passive background of physical reality. I sometimes put it this way. This is a box. It's a treasure box. It's got $1 trillion. But the box is a very strong box. And there's only one key in the whole world to that box. And I've got it. Without that key, nobody can open that box. How much is that key worth? How much is the key worth? Well, if somebody offered $1 million, you'd outbid him, right? If somebody offers $1 billion, somebody else is going to offer $2 billion, $3 billion, $4 billion, right? The price is going to go up all the way till how much? Till $1 trillion minus a penny, I guess. What determines the value of that key? The cost of production of the key? Nah. What determines the value of the key? The value of the key is determined by the usefulness of that key. To whom? To people who would be able to use it to produce what they want. If you want $1 trillion, then that will attribute value to the key. That's the Austrian insight. Nobody's denying that from a physical point of view, this is the engineering chain of cause and effect. But the economic chain of cause and effect, what determines values, what determines how much land is going to be used, what determines the price of land, what determines the price of labor, that's determined by consumer preferences. Cost of production is irrelevant. Irrelevant. Menger glimpsed was an understanding of how the economy works. The economy works because consumers want things. And because they want things, therefore they act. They act, they choose, they bid. And if a smart businessman knows that consumers are bidding, that smart businessman may realize that he can make a profit by satisfying those bids, by satisfying those demands. By doing so, he is acting as the agent, as it were, of the consumers, by directing the resources into those channels which most successfully satisfy the desires of the consumers. And because in a free economy, entrepreneurs are free to do that, therefore they are free to organize the entire mass of transactions that makes up an economic system in a way which is governed by, very important phrase, consumer sovereignty. Consumer sovereignty. It is the sovereignty of the consumer which governs everything. Everything here is determined by the consumer. Obviously, the consumer sovereignty on the moon's surface will be different than consumer sovereignty on the sun's surface and different than consumer sovereignty on the surface of this earth. But it's the consumer sovereignty, it's the consumer desires which call the shots. It's the consumer desires which determine what will actually happen.